Welcome to Unsarkari. We will be covering today the newspaper edition of 2nd of January. To begin with, the central government has issued a series of notifications that will give effect to new tobacco regime from 1st of February. The Finance Ministry has announced that tobacco products would be under the 40% tax bracket as the government ensures that real cigarette prices rise faster than incomes, as emphasized in the international order. The Union Ministry has also notified that the provisions of health security, say National Security Act 2025, which intend to levy a cess on pan masala units, will also come into effect from February 1st. For India, affordability has either stagnated or increased in past decades for tobacco products, but this is contrary to the public health guidelines, which emphasizes that the annual increases in specific excise duties to ensure that real cigarette prices rise faster than incomes, to ensure that the demand for tobacco products decline considerably. Also, the Finance Ministry has notified the new GST rates for tobacco products. BDs would be moved to the 28% slab from the 18% category, and all other tobacco products have been moved to the 40% GST slab. Moving on, a recent study in the British Ecological Society journal People and Nature has, through the synthesis and analysis of ancient Marathi literature, has revealed that savannas are not degraded forests as held before. Savannas in western Maharashtra are far older than commonly believed and should not be treated as degraded forest, according to a study that analyzed and mined medieval Marathi literature and living oral traditions to reconstruct the region's ecological history. The study has showed that open canopy tree grasses, which are symbolical of savanna landscape, are have persisted for at least 750 years in the back and long before colonial timber extractions, and calls for conservation strategy that explicitly value local culture alongside biodiversity. The study has uh, picked up 28 georeference experts from biographies, hagiographies, myths, narrative poems, and OV, a type of verse prose performances, dating from 13th to 20th century. Also, the authors have identified that many plant species and savanna indicators throughout the western Maharashtra region, with an overwhelming signal of open canopy savannas in the past. For instance, a prominent passage from the Adi Parv, dating from the 16th century, has expert that describes cow herders settling near Baramati for grass and water from the Nira river, and have described the land as of fully full of thorny trees. Also, other evidences, including archival paintings and photographs, have depicted sparsely wooded uplands with continuous grass, indicative of savanna landscape and not of degraded forest throughout history. Moving further, Climate change is real, and for India to continue meeting domestic food demands, agriculture needs to cope with the increasing unpredictability of weather, declining soil health, and growing air pollution. Climate resilient agriculture uses a range of biotechnology and complementary technologies to guide farming practices and reduce dependence on chemical inputs while maintaining or improving productivity. The single most important reason for climate resilient agriculture is future food security and and keeping up with the domestic food demands and of the incoming generation, and to provide a sustainable environment for future growth and prosperity. Though so the climate resilient agriculture also consists of biofertilizers and biopesticides, and have considerable use of soil microbiome analysis, genome editing, and which can be developed to withstand drought, heat, salinity, or pest pressures. Also, AI-driven analytics can also be integrated into this type of agriculture, such to generate locally tailored farming strategies. So, in the first place, why does India have a need for a climate resilient agriculture? It is such so because around 51% of India's net sown area is rain fed, and this land produces nearly 40% of the country's food, making it especially vulnerable to climate variability. So, to ensure food security and future sustainable growth, climate resilient agriculture is a must step for the Indian nation and the agricultural sectors and farmers to undertake. Moving on, Gaganyaan, the human spaceflight program, has missed multiple deadlines till now, and now the ISRO, in its new calendar year of 2026, has positioned the first uncrewed mission to be lifted off by March. The Gaganyaan mission, which was announced by the Prime Minister in 2018, was targeted for 2021, but due to the pandemic and other reasons, the deadlines have been missing and have been postponed year after year. The Gaganyaan mission, the ISRO has said that the Gaganyaan mission would be committed to three missions in the financial year of 26, which though is very unlikely to happen due to other commitments of the ISRO, majorly PSLV manufacturing completely by the domestic industry, and carrying of an Earth observation satellite by the PSLV. So these other commitments and other challenges would would be very difficult for the ISRO to continue with Gaganyaan's three scheduled missions in the first quarter. But hope is there, and Gaganyaan, and ultimately the Bharat space station would be reality in the coming future. But today it is a dream far away in the future, and it would be a constant endeavor for ISRO and the central government to achieve so. Moving on, India and EU, the CBAM and FTA bridge. From January 1st, The CBAM, that is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, has been launched, and for the exports of aluminium and steel, this would mean higher cost and shrinking margins. The CBAM, which imposes carbon emission tax that is generated during production upon the importing members of certain industries in the European Union. The tax would likely wipe out 16 to 22% of the actual prices received. They would force contract renegotiations and weaken the presence of Indian products in the European Union, a market that absorbs about 22% of India's steel and aluminium exports. The strain is already visible even before the launching of the CBAM. In the financial year of 2025, India exported $5.8 billion dollars of steel and aluminium to the European Union, which was 24% less than the previous year. Despite no carbon tax, this was due to the European Union rules that required exporters to report plant level carbon emissions under CBAM's transition phase. Compliance costs, data gaps, verification hurdles forced many Indian firms to scale back exports well before CBAM formally became a carbon tax. Well, the CBAM, though can be seen as a progressive tax that counters climate change, it is also an unequal uh, non-trade barrier. While rich countries can afford higher climate cost, poorer economies cannot. China, in comparison to use 80 euro per ton of CO2 tax, only imposes only 10% of the carbon price that the European Union imposes. Applying rich country carbon prices to countries like India raises production cost, hurt exports, and slows industrial growth with almost no impact on global emissions. So the US already imposing a 50% import tariff, and the EU will soon add this new carbon tax through the CBM, which present itself as a climate action, but is in reality, according to the writer, is a tool for industrial protection, revenue generation, and a not non-trade barrier. India must find a resolution for CBAM under the ongoing FTA negotiations with the European Union. Also, EU President, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen visiting the 26th January Republic Day parade would be a significant milestone in addressing dialogue for this new barrier between the two giant blocks. Thus, there is a positive outlook must be done for future endeavors and trade relaxation in this neoliberal phase of world economy. Moving on, Mr. Mehta's article on sober realism talks about uh, a form of fantasy, a political fantasy that has been endeavored throughout 2025 and the post Cold War world. He says that denials of discontent, institutional failure, and slimmering social turbulence are masked by a deceptive calm. He says that once religion, as opined by Marx, that religion was the opium of the masses, yet even religious fantasy rarely confused the real world with an imagined heaven. But contemporary political fantasy is more dangerous. It eclipses reality altogether, often confusing heaven and hell. This political fantasy is shrouded in tales of world dominance and other fairy tales which are far far away from what is the actual reality. In India's case, growth numbers, for instance, conceal the stagnation of private investment. Denial persists in the belief that growth can be willed into existence by confidence alone, bypassing education, skills, competition, massive investments in research and development, and a single minded pursuit of technology leadership is pivotal. That we must end this fantasy land when this progress is not measured against the scale of challenges ahead. India is now faced with the foulest air, polluted rivers, degraded cities, and precarious work, which cannot be reconciled with the claims of incredible India or an economic renaissance. So, in this contest of fantasy and sober reality, which the author puts, must be played out in this Indian democratic endeavor in life. Moving on to the article of Mr. Mohan. Mr. Mohan has highlighted the destruction of the rules based international order and the recent Israel's recognition of Somaliland as an independent state last week marks the definitive breakdown of what we once called the rules based international order. This move comes during the Ukrainian war, where Ukraine has been faced with immense pressure to trade territory for peace. China threatens to take over Taiwan with force, and US has propounded a national security strategy that dismisses the rules-based international order as a liberal illusion and fallacy. In the upcoming 2026, it is clear that the post-Cold War normative framework has lost much of its restraining power. So, what implications are there for India and the wider global South and the Indian subcontinent? It is that from the destruction of the current rules-based international order has implicated that territorial sovereignty is not a privilege anymore that was conferred and protected by the international community. But now, after in the post RBIO order, the territorial sovereignty is a political treasure that must be constantly nurtured and secured against internal divisions and external threats. The recognition of Somaliland by Israel has turned up much criticism and condemnation throughout the global south, and various large blocs and powers. Major critiques have been the Arab states as well as the African Union, which have highlighted that this is a derogation of Somalia's sovereignty and integrity. Several African governments have criticized the violation of Somali sovereignty, but slight voices of subaltern voices are also there, including Ethiopia, which have said that Addis Ababa will not be the first to recognize Somaliland, but it will not be the third either. Over 3 decades, Somaliland has been a de facto state, but In these 30 years, it has not been recognized, symbolizing the post World War rules based international order, but this has been a compromise between political reality and legal principle. By overturning this balance, Israel has acknowledged what many powers already practice. When material interests collide with political norms, the latter are readily sacrificed. China's expansionism in the Indo Pacific over the last decade has clearly said that rules without enforcement means little. In Europe, similarly, Ukraine now faces pressure from its own allies in Europe and America to contemplate territorial concessions to end the war with Russia. New Delhi, the pioneer of the global south and the rules based international order, has continued to invoke the language of norms but has employed it selectively, reluctantly, and inconsistently. India was a staunch advocate of territorial sovereignty in Asia and Africa, but this reluctance, its reluctance to criticize Russia's annexation of Crimea and subsequently invasion of Ukraine in 2022 is a blot. India is unlikely to oppose Israel's move on Somaliland given its closed relationship with Israel and similarly Ethiopia. At the same time, India does not want to alienate the African Union or the Arab countries which oppose Israel's decision. So, India's approach would be a diplomatic balancing act rather than seizing the moral high ground. So, this has been a trade off between what is seen as political pragmatism and rules based morality. Thus, the destruction and breakdown of the rules based international order has, with major powers embracing territorial revisionism, including China in Asia, Russia in Europe, and the United States now in the Western Hemisphere, invoking the doctrine, Monroe Doctrine. So, all in all, it would be an immature and naive assumption for the lesser nations to depend upon the presumed protective shield of the rules based international order, nor can they rely on the solidarity of the so called Global South, regional blocs, including ASEAN, BRICS, and have been failures in protecting this so called rules based international order. Lastly, today, India and Indonesia will be holding a second meeting of Trade Working Group after a period of 5 years. This has been done due to a dip in bilateral trade over the last two financial years. Indonesia is the second largest trade partner for India in the Asian bloc after Singapore, and it is an important nation in scope of variety of items that are exported to Indonesia. Both countries want strengthened trade and investment ties by addressing tariff and non-tariff barriers amid rising global uncertainties, and especially the Trump's US tariffs. The India Indonesia Working Group on Trade and Investment would be the second meeting and would be pivotal from the point of view of India to increase its exports to the Indonesian nation, which has been a global import magnet with importation with imports accounting to 233 billion dollars. This is an this is a huge scope for India to increase its exports to the country. In the financial year of 2025, bilateral trade between India and Indonesia was at $28 billion, with India's exports only accounting for $5 billion, which has declined in scope of in comparing with financial year of 2023, where bilateral trade started at almost $38 billion. So this remarkable dip in the trade has been the whistle for this second meeting, and both the countries would endeavor to thus gain back at the financial year 2023 markings, and of course address global uncertainties and shared prosperity goals. This would be all for today. Thank you.